As I stepped into the church, I couldn't help but notice the pastor's wife, Mrs. Smith. She was a woman in her late 30s, with a warm smile and piercing brown eyes. She greeted me with a firm handshake and a gentle hug, making me feel welcome and at ease. I had just moved to the city and was looking for a new church to attend. A friend had recommended the Holy Assembly, and I was eager to check it out. As I took my seat, I couldn't help but notice the vibrant atmosphere of the church. The worship team was lively, the congregation was enthusiastic, and the pastor's sermon was inspiring. But as the days went by, I began to notice something strange. Mrs. Smith seemed to be everywhere, always smiling, always chatting with the men of the church. She would often touch their arms or pat their backs, and they would look at her with admiration and respect. At first, I thought nothing of it. I assumed she was just being friendly and hospitable. But as the weeks turned into months, I started to feel a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the way Mrs. Smith interacted with the men of the church. It was the way they looked at her, the way they talked about her. They would often comment on her beauty, her grace, and her kindness. They would talk about how she was always there for them, how she would listen to their problems and offer them advice. And they would often joke about how lucky the pastor was to have such a wonderful wife. But as I listened to their conversations, I started to feel a growing sense of doubt. Was Mrs. Smith really as righteous and God-fearing as she seemed? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, but they kept coming back. I started to notice little things about Mrs. Smith's behavior, things that didn't quite add up. She would often disappear during the service, only to return with a mysterious smile on her face. And she would often receive phone calls during the week, calls that would leave her looking flushed and excited. I didn't know what to make of it all. Part of me wanted to believe that Mrs. Smith was innocent, that she was just a kind and caring person who was devoted to her husband and her church. But another part of me was screaming warning signs, telling me that something was seriously wrong. As the tension built up inside me, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back and watch as Mrs. Smith continued to charm and deceive the men of the church. I had to confront her, to ask her what was really going on. But as I approached her after the service, I felt a sense of trepidation. What if I was wrong? What if Mrs. Smith was really as innocent as she seemed? I took a deep breath and asked her if I could talk to her for a minute. "Of course," she said, smiling sweetly at me. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, unsure of how to phrase my question. But then I looked in her eyes, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Smith," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I need to ask you something. Is everything okay? You seem to be really close to the men of the church." Mrs. Smith's smile faltered for a moment, and I saw a flash of something in her eyes. But then she regained her composure, and her smile returned. "Oh, I'm just being friendly," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I like to make people feel welcome and included. That's all." I nodded, unsure of what to say next. Part of me wanted to believe her, but another part of me was screaming warning signs. I knew I had to dig deeper to find out what was really going on. But as I turned to leave, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Mrs. Smith, her eyes glinting with a knowing look. "Wait," she said, her voice low and husky. "I think we need to talk more about this. Why don't you come to my house tomorrow night, and we can discuss it further?" I felt a shiver run down my spine as I looked into her eyes. What was she really after? And what secrets was she hiding? I knew I had to be careful, but I also knew I had to uncover the truth. "I'll be there," I said, trying to sound calm. Mrs. Smith smiled, her eyes glinting with triumph. "I'll be waiting," she said. As I walked away, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was walking into a trap. But I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. When I get home, couldn't concentrate on anything else for the rest of the day. My mind kept wandering back to Mrs. Smith and her mysterious invitation. What did she want to talk to me about? And why did she want to meet at her house? As the sun began to set, I made my way home, my heart racing with anticipation. I tried to distract myself by watching TV and browsing the internet, but nothing seemed to work. My mind was fixated on Mrs. Smith and our upcoming meeting. Finally, the clock struck 9 p.m., and I knew I had to get some rest. I went to bed, but my sleep was fitful. I kept waking up, thinking about Mrs. Smith and what she might have planned. The next day, I woke up feeling anxious and on edge. I tried to calm myself down by praying and reading the Bible, but nothing seemed to work. I knew I had to face whatever Mrs. Smith had in store for me. As the evening approached, I made my way to Mrs. Smith's house. The sky was dark and foreboding, and the air was filled with an eerie silence. I felt like I was walking into a trap, but I steeled myself and rang the doorbell. Mrs. Smith answered the door, looking more beautiful than ever. She smiled warmly and invited me in. I hesitated for a moment, but then I stepped inside. The house was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the scent of perfume. Mrs. Smith led me to the living room, where we sat down on the couch. She poured me a glass of wine and began to chat with me, asking me questions about my life and my interests. I tried to relax and enjoy the conversation, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. Mrs. Smith seemed too perfect, too polished, and there was something in her eyes, something that made me feel like she was hiding something. As the evening wore on, I began to feel more and more uncomfortable. Mrs. Smith's questions became more personal, more probing, and I started to realize that she was trying to manipulate me to get me to do something I didn't want to do. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around, and that's when I saw him. Reverend Smith, the pastor of the church, was standing in the doorway, a look of shock and anger on his face. "What's going on here?" he thundered, his voice echoing through the room. Mrs. Smith smiled sweetly and stood up. "Why, Reverend Smith," she said, "I was just having a little chat with our friend here." But Reverend Smith was not fooled. He looked at me with a mixture of sadness and concern. "I think it's time for you to leave," he said. I nodded and stood up, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Smith's face. She looked angry, furious, and I knew that I had just stumbled into something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. As I walked out of the house, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was in grave danger. I knew that I had to get to the bottom of whatever was going on, but I also knew that I had to be careful. I was dealing with forces that were beyond my control, forces that would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. I walked home, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I had just scratched the surface of something sinister, something that threatened to destroy everything I held dear. And I knew that I had to be brave, to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. As I walked home, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. I looked over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I quickened my pace, my heart racing with anticipation. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I knew I had to think clearly and figure out what was going on. I started by replaying the events of the evening in my mind. Mrs. Smith's behavior had been suspicious, to say the least, and Reverend Smith's reaction had been even more telling. It was clear that something was going on, but I had no idea what. I decided to do some research and see if I could uncover any information about the church or its leaders. I sat down at my computer and started searching, but I didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to give up, I received a message on my phone. It was from an unknown number, and all it said was, "Meet me at the coffee shop on Main St at 10 p.m. Come alone." I was immediately on high alert. Who could be sending me mysterious messages? And what did they want with me? Despite my reservations, I decided to go to the meeting. I had to know what was going on, and I was willing to take a risk to find out. At 10 p.m., I made my way to the coffee shop. It was deserted, except for a figure sitting in the corner. As I approached, the figure stood up, and I saw that it was a woman. She was dressed in a long coat, and her face was obscured by a hood. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman pushed back her hood, revealing a face that was familiar yet strange. It was Mrs. Smith, but her eyes were different. They were cold and calculating, and they seemed to bore into my soul. "I'm someone who knows the truth," she said, her voice low and menacing. "And I'm here to tell you that you're in grave danger." I was taken aback by her words. What did she mean? And why was she warning me? But before I could ask any questions, Mrs. Smith turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me with more questions than answers. I was left standing there, feeling confused and scared. What was going on? And what did Mrs. Smith mean by her warning? I knew I had to get to the bottom of things, but I was also aware that I was taking a risk. I was dealing with forces that were beyond my control, and I could get hurt. But I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. I was ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead, knowing that I was fighting for what was right. The next following Sunday, Reverend Smith called me after service because he already knew what his wife is trying to do. Reverend Smith took a deep breath and began to speak in a low, measured tone. "The church has been taken over by a dark force," he said. "A force that masquerades as righteousness, but is actually evil incarnate." I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to his words. What was he talking about? And what did he mean by dark force? "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Reverend Smith hesitated, looking around nervously. "I'm talking about the spirit of fornication," he said. "It's a spirit that seeks to destroy marriages, families, and communities. And it's taken hold of our church." I was shocked by his words. The spirit of fornication? I had never heard of such a thing. How did this happen? I asked, trying to understand. Reverend Smith sighed, his eyes filled with sadness. "It started with my wife," he said. "She was seduced by the spirit, and she began to spread its influence throughout the church. At first, I didn't realize what was happening. But as time went on, I saw the changes in her, and I knew that something was wrong. I felt a wave of compassion wash over me as I listened to Reverend Smith's words. He was a broken man, torn apart by the evil that had taken hold of his church. "What can we do?" I asked, determined to help. Reverend Smith looked at me, his eyes filled with desperation. "We have to expose the truth," he said. "We have to reveal the spirit of fornication for what it is, and we have to cast it out of our church." I nodded, my heart filled with determination. I was ready to join Reverend Smith in his fight against the forces of evil. Together, we could overcome anything. But as we stood there, ready to face whatever lay ahead, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were in grave danger. The spirit of fornication was a powerful enemy, and it would stop at nothing to maintain its hold on the church. I looked at Reverend Smith, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He knew that we were taking a risk, that we could be hurt or even killed. But he also knew that we had to try, that we had to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Together, we took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. We were in this together, and we would see it through to the end. As we stepped forward, I could feel the weight of the task ahead of us. We were about to take on a powerful enemy, one that had already taken hold of the church and its members. Reverend Smith led me to a small room in the back of the church, where he kept a collection of books and documents. He began to rummage through the shelves, pulling out dusty old tomes and flipping through their yellowed pages. "What are you looking for?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. Reverend Smith looked up, his eyes shining with determination. "I'm looking for proof," he said. "Proof that the spirit of fornication is real, and that it's taken hold of our church." As he searched, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. What if we were wrong? What if the spirit of fornication was just a myth, a way to explain away the problems of the church? But Reverend Smith seemed to sense my doubts, and he turned to me with a reassuring smile. "I know it's hard to believe," he said, "but I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen the way the members of the church look at each other, the way they flirt and whisper in the halls. It's not just a matter of people being friendly or affectionate. It's something deeper, something darker." As he spoke, I felt a chill run down my spine. I had seen it too, the way the members of the church seemed to be under some kind of spell. And I knew that Reverend Smith was right. We were dealing with something powerful, something that threatened to destroy the very fabric of the church. Finally, after what felt like hours of searching, Reverend Smith found what he was looking for. He pulled out a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "This is the proof we need to expose the spirit of fornication and cast it out of our church." I took the book from him, feeling a sense of trepidation. What secrets did it hold? And what would happen when we revealed them to the world? As I opened the book, I felt a sense of unease. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, and the text was written in a language I couldn't understand. But Reverend Smith seemed to know exactly what he was looking for. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a particular passage. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "This is the proof we need to expose the spirit of fornication and cast it out of our church." I looked at the passage, trying to make sense of it, and then, suddenly, it hit me. The truth was staring me right in the face, and I couldn't believe I had missed it. "It's not just the spirit of fornication," I said, my voice filled with shock. "It's something much bigger than that. Something that threatens to destroy not just the church, but the entire community." Reverend Smith looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "What are you talking about?" he asked. I took a deep breath, trying to process the enormity of what I had just discovered. "I'm talking about a conspiracy," I said. "A conspiracy that goes all the way to the top of the church. And it's not just about the spirit of fornication. It's about something much darker, something that threatens to destroy us all." Reverend Smith's eyes widened in shock as he listened to my words. He took a step back, as if he had been punched in the gut. "A conspiracy?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath and began to explain. "I'm talking about a group of people within the church who are working together to spread the spirit of fornication," I said. "They're using their positions of power to manipulate and control others. And they're doing it all in the name of the church." Reverend Smith's face turned white as he listened to my words. He looked like he was about to pass out. "How did you discover this?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I've been doing some research," I said. "I've been talking to people and gathering information. And what I've found is shocking." Reverend Smith nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We have to expose them," he said. "We have to bring them to justice." I nodded in agreement. "But we have to be careful," I said. "We don't know who we can trust. We have to be strategic and plan our next move carefully." Reverend Smith nodded, his face set in a determined expression. "I'll start gathering evidence," he said. "I'll talk to people and see what they know, and then we'll take it to the authorities." I nodded, feeling a sense of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, we could bring an end to the spirit of fornication and restore the church to its former glory. But as we stood there, making our plans, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. Still, the feeling persisted. And then, just as we were about to leave, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see Mrs. Smith standing in the doorway. Thanks for watching Faith Tonic. Don't forget to like, share, and click the subscribe button for more videos.